It was a crisp autumn afternoon in 2008 when Margaret, alone in her small kitchen, stirred a pot of soup. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, mixing with the earthy scent of the woods outside. Her little house, tucked on the edge of a quiet country lane, had always been a peaceful escape. She was used to solitude, and it had become her companion over the years. Suddenly, the sound of a car stopping outside broke the quiet. Margaret glanced out the window and saw a man leaning over his car's flat tire. He looked frustrated, tired, and far from home. Without a second thought, she stepped outside. "Excuse me," the man said with a strained smile. "I've got a flat tire, and I'm starving. Could I trouble you for a bit of food while I try to figure this out?" Margaret smiled, sensing he wasn't asking for too much. "I've got soup and fresh bread. Please come in." The man introduced himself as Thomas, a truck driver who worked at a nearby diner. As they ate, their conversation turned to life, and Margaret found herself opening up. She shared that she was an orphan, raised in foster care, and now worked at the diner down the lane to make ends meet. "And what about you?" she asked, genuinely curious. "What's your family like?" Thomas paused for a moment before responding. "I'm an orphan too. Grew up in foster care, moved around a lot. Never really had anyone looking out for me." His voice softened. "But I get by. We all do." The connection between them was immediate. Their shared experiences as orphans and the weight of their pasts created a bond neither of them had expected. After that first meeting, Thomas started passing by her house every 10 days, sometimes for a quick chat, sometimes just to drop by for a meal. Every time they met, they found themselves falling a little more in love. 3 months later, Thomas asked Margaret to marry him. It felt right. It felt like home. They married in the spring and moved into Thomas's house, which sat on the outskirts of a small, isolated town. There were a few other homes scattered around, but it was a quiet, peaceful place. The house was modest, but it was theirs. They settled into their new life, enjoying the calm and simplicity it offered. Thomas was a loving, caring husband. Every morning, before leaving for work, he would give Margaret a gentle kiss and blow her a flying kiss as he drove off, making sure she caught it with a smile. Neighbors would wave as he passed, always cheerful, always kind. To everyone, they seemed like the perfect couple. For 10 years, their life together was full of love and routine. But one day, Thomas came home with an announcement that would change everything. He told Margaret he had received an offer to work as a truck driver in Australia. It was a big opportunity, one that would pay well and set them up for the future. But it would take 5 years before he could return. "I've got to go, Margaret," Thomas said, his voice tinged with both excitement and sadness. "They want me to work in Australia for 5 years. The money's good. We'll be set when I get back. But I won't be able to stay in touch much. I'll call occasionally, and I'll send money every month, but, it's going to be hard to stay in touch." Margaret's heart sank as she processed the words. 5 years. It seemed like forever. But she nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'll wait for you, Thomas." "I always will." He kissed her forehead, promising to return after 5 years and be with her in their home once again. He promised he would come back to the USA, to their quiet life in the small town. But for now, it would just be the two of them living apart, her in their home, waiting for his return. As Thomas drove off that day, Margaret stood at the front porch, watching him disappear down the road. She caught his flying kiss, and for a moment, everything felt like it would be okay. But deep inside, a creeping doubt began to form. Would he really come back? It had been 5 years and 6 months. Margaret had waited patiently, holding on to the promise Thomas made when he left for Australia. He'd been excited about the opportunity, a truck driver job that would set them up for a good future. But now, 5 years later, something was wrong. The calls had stopped, the transfers had become increasingly cold, and the silence in their home had grown too loud to ignore. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone in her hands. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting a soft light over her small, cozy house. The silence felt suffocating now. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Thomas had promised he would return after 5 years, yet here she was, alone. 5 years, 6 months to be exact. Something in her gut told her this wasn't just an issue of bad timing or miscommunication. She couldn't keep waiting. She had to know the truth. Taking a deep breath, Margaret stood up and walked toward the door, leaving the house that had once felt like a sanctuary. She drove the familiar route to the small local police station, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel the weight of every passing minute, the years of doubt pressing down on her chest. The door to the station jingled as Margaret entered, and a uniformed officer behind the counter, Officer Lewis, a young man with a tired expression, looked up. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but professional, clearly used to dealing with various concerns that came through the station doors. "I need to file a missing persons report," Margaret said, her voice steady but laced with an underlying anxiety. She could already feel the familiar weight of the conversation hanging in the air. "My husband, Thomas. He went abroad 5 years ago. He promised he'd be back in 5 years, but now, it's been 6 months longer, and I haven't heard from him." Officer Lewis raised an eyebrow, a slight frown on his face as he set down the file he'd been reading. "I see. And when did you last hear from him, ma'am?" Margaret swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. "A few months ago. The phone calls, they were always brief, short, distant, and the money transfers stopped being consistent. It doesn't feel right. He promised he'd come home, and now, nothing." The officer nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "All right. Why wait until now to report him missing? 5 years is a long time." Margaret took a breath, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. "Because he promised. He said exactly 5 years. And now, 6 months later, he hasn't come back. Something is wrong. I know something is wrong." Officer Lewis studied her for a moment, his expression neutral, before leaning back in his chair and pulling up the records on his computer. "We'll need more details, ma'am. We'll start with the phone records and the financials. We've got to track down where he was last, who he's been in contact with, and—" "Yes, please," Margaret interrupted, a mix of frustration and urgency in her voice. "I need you to look closer. He's not just gone for work. I feel it. Something's happened. I need you to help me find out what happened." The officer's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained professional. "Understood. We'll open an investigation, but I have to be clear. It might take some time to dig through everything and find the answers." Margaret nodded, her stomach sinking as she felt the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a typical missing persons case. Thomas was out there somewhere, and she wasn't leaving until she found the truth. The rest of the conversation moved quickly. Officer Lewis took her information down, made notes about Thomas's last known whereabouts, and assured her the investigation would begin immediately. But the nagging doubts remained in Margaret's mind. Why had it taken this long for her to come forward? And why was she only now beginning to see the cracks in Thomas's story? The records came through soon after. The wire transfers were consistent, but the calls were odd, always brief, always at strange times. No real details. As she left the station, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something hidden. The days following the missing persons report were a blur for Margaret. The initial shock of opening up to the police had worn off, replaced by a dull ache of anxiety and dread. The officers had promised they would look into it, but deep down, Margaret knew the truth. Something was off. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that her husband's disappearance wasn't just the result of distance or circumstance. It was something darker, something buried. And now, she was starting to understand just how deep the lie went. Detective Callahan was the one who took over the investigation. A seasoned officer with years of experience, his presence was enough to send a cold chill down Margaret's spine. He was methodical, professional, and didn't seem interested in the warmth of her emotions. His job was to find answers, no matter how difficult they might be. "Tell me again," he said, his voice low but steady. "Where exactly did Thomas go?" Margaret shifted in her seat, uncomfortable under the detective's scrutinizing gaze. "He went abroad, Australia. He found a job there, said he was going to save money for us." Callahan nodded, tapping his pen on the table. "And when exactly did he leave?" 5 years ago. January, Margaret replied, her voice cracking slightly. She hated how it sounded, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "And when was the last time you heard from him?" She swallowed hard. "A few months ago. The calls were short. He said he was busy, told me everything was fine, but it doesn't feel right anymore." Detective Callahan leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any photos of him while he was away? Video calls? Anything that could prove he was really in Australia?" Margaret hesitated. "No, he hated cameras, always said they were a waste of time. We never took pictures, not even on our trips." The detective scribbled something down in his notebook, clearly unimpressed by her answer. "I see." He paused, as if pondering something for a moment. "And have you spoken with any of his friends? Anyone who can confirm where he's been or what he's been doing?" Margaret shook her head. "No, not really. He wasn't close with many people. He kept to himself, just the occasional phone call." Callahan didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at her with a critical look in his eyes. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, wishing the interrogation would be over. She wasn't lying, but she knew she wasn't telling the whole truth either. Her mind kept returning to the locked basement door, a part of her home she had grown to fear over the years. What would happen if they found out about it? Later that afternoon, the officers visited Margaret's neighbors. They were friendly, quiet people who didn't know much but had seen the couple over the years. They all spoke highly of Thomas, describing him as a hard-working, reserved man. When asked about Thomas's departure, the neighbors were clear. They'd always been told he was working abroad, nothing more. There was nothing unusual about his leave. No one had seen him packing or preparing to go. But then, one neighbor spoke up with a question that made the officers pause. "Now that I think about it," she said, scratching her head, "I never saw him leave with any bags. No luggage, no passport, nothing. And I thought it was odd at the time. But I didn't ask." That was all the confirmation Detective Callahan needed. He turned to his partner, Officer Davis, and said, "Let's take a look inside the house." If Thomas left, he didn't leave by the book. Back at Margaret's house, the officers moved carefully through the rooms, searching for anything that might reveal the truth. The living room was exactly as it had always been. Neat, tidy, no signs of anything unusual. The bedroom looked the same too, the bed made with the same sheets Margaret had always used. It all felt like the world she had built with Thomas. Safe, familiar. But there was one room they hadn't checked yet, the basement. Detective Callahan led the way to the door at the bottom of the stairs. It stood, almost innocently, locked. But there was something about it that seemed out of place. The door was reinforced with thick iron bolts, as though it had been deliberately sealed shut. "This the storage room you mentioned?" Callahan asked, turning to Margaret, his voice cold. Margaret stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. She nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, it's just storage. We keep old furniture and stuff down there, nothing important." Callahan raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Then why the heavy lock?" he asked. "Seems a bit much for a storage room." I don't know. We lost the key years ago," Margaret stammered, but she knew it sounded weak. "I haven't been down there in a long time. I never had the need to check." He didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he took out his keys and tried the lock, finding it secure. No sign of it being tampered with. After a moment, he turned to Davis. "Cut it open," he said, his voice firm. Davis nodded, pulling out a crowbar. As he worked at the lock, Margaret felt her stomach twist. She could already hear the noise of metal scraping against metal, the sound of the door giving way. The tension in the room was suffocating. Margaret's pulse raced as she backed away from the door, her mind screaming at her to stop them. But she knew it was too late. With one final tug, the door opened. The air in the basement was thick, damp, and suffocating. The officers took tentative steps inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the room's grim contents. The smell hit them like a wall: decay, rot, and something far worse. It was a smell that told a story no one wanted to hear. As they moved deeper into the space, the beam of Detective Callahan's flashlight landed on a figure tied to a rusted bed frame. His body was skeletal, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes wide with fear and confusion. Thomas. His lips were sewn shut, a grotesque attempt to silence him. His body was covered in deep, brutal wounds, marks of prolonged suffering. His frame was malnourished, too weak to even move. The sight was beyond comprehension. How could someone let this happen? How could Margaret, the woman who had once loved him, do this? The officers quickly confirmed the identity. DNA testing confirmed it was him. The shock of the discovery hit Detective Callahan like a blow to the chest. Margaret stood in the doorway, frozen, her face pale as the scene in front of her unfolded. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. "Margaret," Callahan's voice was cold, his tone unforgiving. "What the hell is this?" She didn't answer right away. The room spun, her vision blurring as she tried to process the horror before her. They arrested her. Later that day, Margaret sat in the interrogation room, her wrists cuffed to the chair. Her face was pale, but her eyes were oddly calm, almost detached, as if she had already accepted the consequences. Detective Callahan leaned in, his voice quiet but forceful. "Why, Margaret? Why did you do this?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, but the words came out slow and steady. "I was just a girl, an orphan, looking for a place to belong. I thought I found it in Thomas. He seemed so loving at first, but it was all a lie. I was his prisoner, not his wife. He would hit me, humiliate me, and then in the morning, act like nothing happened. He would apologize and tell me he loved me. I wanted to believe him. But after he kicked me when I was pregnant, after I lost our baby, I couldn't take it anymore. I was his victim, and I finally decided to become the monster he made me." The silence in the room hung thick like a fog. Detective Callahan's jaw tightened. He'd seen his fair share of brutality, but something about this was different. The coldness in her voice, the calmness. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just revenge. It was something much darker. "Him," she whispered, "and locked him in that basement. Every night, I took the revenge he deserved, but I fed him small to keep him alive till my revenge completes. 10 years of torture, completed in 5. And I made sure he felt every second of it. I wanted him to know what it felt like, physical and mental torture." Callahan's heart sank. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He'd never heard anyone speak like this. The disgust, the horror, mixed with a chilling sense of satisfaction. It was as if Margaret had justified everything she had done. He fought the urge to look away. He asked, "Why did you endure for 10 years? Thomas made me believe I deserved it, that the pain was my fault. For 10 years I endured, convinced I was nothing without him." Margaret's voice shook slightly as she continued. "But then Lily, my friend from the orphanage, made me see the truth. She told me I didn't deserve this. She told me to escape, but I couldn't. I didn't want freedom. I wanted revenge." Then came the question that everyone had been dreading. If he was locked up here, who sent the money? Who made the calls? Margaret paused. For the first time, there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "It was Lily," she said, almost too softly to hear. "She's my friend from the orphanage. She's been living abroad. I couldn't let anyone know the truth. I couldn't let anyone know he was down there. So, I asked Lily to send the money and make the calls. She pretended to be Thomas on the phone. Every time she'd say things like, 'Bad connection, I'm busy at work,' she'd wire the money. We made it all seem real." Detective Callahan's face hardened. "And why file the complaint?" Margaret let out a breath, her gaze fixed on the table. "Because people started asking questions. The neighbors wanted to know why he wasn't coming back. 5 years. That was the story I told them. If I didn't complain, if I didn't say something, they would have started suspecting me." She leaned back in her chair, her voice calm, almost resigned. "I knew the truth would come out eventually, but I had to make him pay. I had to make sure he suffered before the world found out. I wanted my revenge." The silence in the room was deafening. Detective Callahan sat back, stunned by what he had just heard. His fingers drummed quietly on the table, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just a case of abuse or neglect. This was something far more twisted. For a long moment, the officers in the room were silent, processing the sheer horror of her words. There was a coldness to Margaret now, something almost unrecognizable. Her calm demeanor, her detachment from the pain she'd inflicted, it shook them all. It shook Callahan to his core. The last thing he had expected was for the victim to become the perpetrator. But here she was, sitting across from him, recounting her sickening revenge with an eerie calm. It was as if she had stripped away any last shred of humanity, replaced by something darker. As the officers led her away in handcuffs, her face was serene, almost peaceful. The same woman who had been a victim, an orphan seeking love, had become a cold reflection of the torment she endured. She was no longer the woman who had fallen in love with Thomas. She was something else entirely. The officers could barely look at her as they escorted her from the room, the weight of her confession lingering in the air. How can cruelty transform the innocent into something monstrous? This is what happens when the victim becomes the perpetrator.